Lecture 35, Gender Dimorphism. So far in these lectures, we've looked at psychological development fairly abstractly, examining in general terms the interaction between nature and nurture, between the person and the environment, and the role of the individual as an agent in his or her own development. Now we want to get concrete and look at these processes as they unfold to generate what is perhaps the most central feature of our personalities and identities, our biological sex as male or female, our gender identity as man or woman, boy or girl, our gender roles as masculine or feminine or whatever, and our sexual orientation as heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, or even asexual.
At first glance, gender dimorphism would seem like a clear-cut case of genetic determination. The human genome contains two sex chromosomes, an X chromosome and a Y chromosome. Individuals with two X chromosomes are genetically female. Individuals with an X and a Y chromosome are genetically male. The developing fetus follows its genetic blueprint so that the individual is born male or female. People identify the child as such, as male or female, at the moment of birth. And when the child's achieved a particular level of cognitive development, the child identifies him or herself as a little boy or a little girl, and grows up to be a more or less feminine girl or a more or less masculine man. And because that's how little boys and girls came to be in the first place, men are attracted to women and women to men as sexual partners. It all starts out in the genes and those X and Y chromosomes. It's a good story. I wish it were that simple, but it turns out to be much more complicated and much more interesting than that.
To begin to see how complicated things are, let's look at the case of Caster Semenya, a South African athlete who, in 2009, won the gold medal at the women's 800-meter race in the World Track and Field Championships in Berlin. She didn't just win it, she left the rest of the field in the dust, shaving several seconds off the record time, and immediately raising questions about whether she was, in fact, female. Semenya was raised as a girl and identifies herself as a woman. Nevertheless, the International Association of Athletics Federations began a set of testing procedures to determine whether Semenya was, in fact, female. A matter that, if things were so simple, would be resolved by a simple chromosome smear. Is she genetically XX or genetically XY? In fact, the sex determination testing involved not just karyotyping of the chromosome smear, but also a complete physical examination, reports from a gynecologist and endocrinologist, a psychologist, a specialist on internal medicine, and an expert on gender. That's how complicated gender dimorphism is. Of course, gender dimorphism does begin with the genes. It just doesn't end there. As we've discussed before, a normal human cell possesses 46 chromosomes arranged in 23 pairs. Two of these chromosomes making up a single pair are the sex chromosomes known as X and Y. Normally, males carry one X and one Y chromosome, while females carry two X chromosomes. Genes for certain sex-linked traits are located on these sex chromosomes. Note that because each parent contributes one chromosome of each pair to his or her offspring, and the mother can contribute only X chromosomes to this process. In the final analysis, the father determines the sex of the child, that is, the chromosomal sex of the child. If he contributes an X chromosome, the child will be genetically female, XX. If he contributes a Y chromosome, the child will be genetically male, XY. It turns out that the genes are not decisive for gender identity, gender role, sexual orientation, or even biological sex. Rather, the genes initiate a complex program for gender dimorphism, which passes from the genes to the hormones to the child's autobiographical history. Thereafter, the program is continuously exchanged between the biological and the social environment, and at some point the child, him or herself, will take an active role in this process. In this lecture, we'll see how this process unfolds. I want to say at the outset that much of this lecture draws heavily on a book by John Money of Johns Hopkins University and Anke Ehrhardt of Columbia University, entitled Man and Woman, Boy and Girl, which provides an engrossing account of the processes involved in gender dimorphism. Some of Money's work has been controversial, and we'll talk about that. But the basic picture that he and Ehrhardt give of the development of various aspects of gender dimorphism has stood the test of time. In their book, Money and Ehrhardt trace the complex interaction between genetic and biochemical processes, what they call the phyletic imprimatur, and social environmental processes, what they call the social imprimatur. The term imprimatur comes from the Latin, meaning what is permitted. Money and Ehrhardt argue that there are some aspects of gender dimorphism that occur simply by virtue of the way we're built as biological organisms. They're part of what it means to be human, biologically speaking. And there are other parts of gender dimorphism that really arise from the individual's own autobiographical history, the choices they make, the constraints imposed by the person's society and culture. Money and Ehrhardt argue that there are some differences between men and women that are built into us by our biology. They call these the procreative imperatives because they're necessary for reproduction. These procreative imperatives are menstruation, gestation, and lactation in females, and impregnation in males. But Money and Ehrhardt want to make clear that the role differences between the sexes go beyond the demands of reproduction, and that's where the social imprimatur comes in. The fetus is genetically male or female from the beginning because its cells carry the XX or XY chromosome pairs from the beginning. Nevertheless, early in gestation, for about the first 6 weeks of gestation, the fetus is otherwise undifferentiated with respect to gender. Although it carries the XX or XY chromosomal endowment, it has no outward appearance of being male or female. The gonadal tissue of the fetus is undifferentiated. It is a primordial structure, which will eventually differentiate into the more complex structures of the male and female reproductive anatomy. In technical terms, the structure of this undifferentiated gonadal tissue contains the Anlagen, or foundation, of the male and female reproductive systems. The outer cortex will become the ovaries of the female. The inner medulla will become the testes of the male. The Mullerian ducts will become the internal reproductive organs of the female, the uterus, the fallopian tube, and the inner portion of the vagina. The Wolffian ducts will become the internal reproductive organs of the male, the vas deferens, the seminal vesicles, and ejaculatory ducts. Finally, the genital tubercle itself is situated above a single urogenital slit surrounded by urethral folds and labioscrotal swellings. This will become the external genitalia, the clitoris and vagina of the female, or the penis and the scrotum of the male. After about 6 weeks gestation, the sexual differentiation of the fetus begins. In response to genetic messages carried on the X and Y chromosomes, one set of structures begins to develop, while the other becomes vestigial. If the fetus carries the XY genotype, the inner medulla will grow into the testes of the male, and the outer cortex will regress. If the fetus contains the XX genotype, the outer cortex will grow into the ovaries of the female, while the inner medulla will vestigiate. The genes themselves appear to play no further role in what happens. Rather, further sexual differentiation occurs by virtue of hormones secreted by the gonads, and in particular, male hormones secreted by the testes. There may be an additional role for the female hormones in genetically XX fetuses, but this isn't completely clear at present. As a rough approximation, further sexual differentiation appears to reflect what the biologists call nature's rule, which is, add something to masculinize. Without vascularization instigated by the male gonadal hormones, the remaining gonadal tissue will naturally differentiate into the female reproductive system. So, in a sense, at this point, the program for sexual dimorphism passes from the genes to the hormones. The genes play no further role after differentiating the outer cortex or the inner medulla. Once the initial differentiation of the gonads has taken place, further gender dimorphism in fetal development is the responsibility of hormones secreted by the testes, which have effects on other structures of the initially undifferentiated gonadal tissue. In the 3rd month of gestation, a hormone known as the Mullerian inhibiting substance stops the development of the Mullerian duct system. At the same time, fetal androgen promotes the development of the Wolffian duct system into the male internal reproductive organs. In the absence of the Mullerian inhibiting substance and androgen, the Mullerian ducts will develop naturally into the female internal reproductive system. In the 3rd and 4th months of gestation, we observe additional effects of fetal androgen. The genital tubercle will form around the urethra into a penis rather than a clitoris, and the labioscrotal swelling will fuse into a scrotum rather than a vagina. Again, in the absence of this dose of androgen, these structures will naturally develop into the clitoris and vagina of the female. In successive months, the vaginal canal will connect the external and internal reproductive anatomy of the female. In the 7th month of gestation, the testes descend from the abdomen into the scrotum of the male. When everything goes as programmed, after 9 months of gestation, a human baby is born with a set of external genitalia that are recognizably male or female, and a corresponding set of male or female internal reproductive organs. But sometimes things don't run quite the way they're programmed, and the child is born sexually ambiguous, individuals who are known technically as pseudo-hermaphrodites. Pseudo-hermaphrodites because they're not really hermaphrodites. They don't really have the reproductive anatomy of both males and females. Different anomalies can occur in individuals who are chromosomally XX, genetically female, and those who are chromosomally XY, genetically male. If a genetic female somehow experiences a uterine environment to which androgen has been added, she will be born with female internal genitalia, but most likely a large clitoris and fused vaginal labia. Rarely, such a girl will be born with a normal-appearing penis and scrotum. Of course, the scrotum will be empty because there are no testes to descend into it. This occurs in 2 principal ways. In the female adrenogenital syndrome, there is a natural failure of the adrenal glands to function properly, resulting in the circulation of androgen to a fetus that is genetically female. There are no effects on the internal reproductive anatomy, but the external genitalia are masculinized. These children receive surgical correction of the external genitalia. At puberty, because they have malfunctioning adrenal glands, they also receive cortisone therapy to counter the adrenal failure. As a result of this therapy, the girl develops a characteristic feminine physique, is capable of menstruation, and can conceive and bear children. In progesterone-induced pseudohermaphroditism, a pregnant woman, perhaps with a personal or family history of difficult pregnancy, may receive synthetic hormones intended to prevent miscarriage. In some cases, this hormone treatment results in masculinization of the external genitalia, which again is corrected surgically. Because there's no problem with the endogenous hormones, there's no need for cortisone therapy to feminize the physique or induce menarche. In both cases, the female adrenogenital syndrome and progestin-induced pseudohermaphroditism, the children are raised as girls. Now let's turn to what can happen with chromosomally XY individuals, genetic males. In a genetic male, the failure of the Mullerian inhibiting substance can leave the fetus with a set of male external genitalia, but both the female and male internal reproductive systems. Note, however, that such an individual has only testes. The gonadal tissue can become either testes or ovaries, but not both. Thus, these individuals cannot menstruate or gestate, and these children are raised as boys. Another anomaly that can occur in chromosomally XY individuals is called the androgen insensitivity syndrome. Here, a genetic defect causes the androgen, which circulates naturally to the male fetus, to have no masculinizing effect on the external genitalia. The result is that the child is born without male external genitalia, except perhaps for an enlarged clitoris. Following surgical correction, including removal of the testes, these children are typically raised as girls. At the time of puberty, natural estrogen, which circulates to males as well as females, but which is suppressed by androgen in hormonally normal males, feminizes the physique. However, these girls do not possess the internal reproductive anatomy of females. Under genetic control, the inner medulla has already differentiated into the testes, while the outer cortex has regressed. And the Mullerian inhibiting substance works even if the androgen does not, so these girls have no ovaries. Therefore, they will not menstruate, and they will be infertile. In another condition, Klinefelter syndrome, a chromosomal male has an extra X chromosome. He is 47 XXY rather than the usual 46 XY. This is very rare. Common consequences include a feminized physique, infertility, delayed motor and speech development, and difficulties with reading and writing. Many of these symptoms can be reversed with hormone replacement therapy, replacing the testosterone that is missing naturally. And then there are the guevadoches. I'll leave the translation from the Spanish up to you. Originally discovered in an isolated area of the Dominican Republic, these are genetically male individuals, chromosomal XY, who were born with a particular defect in their androgen system known as 5-alpha reductase deficiency syndrome. These fetuses do not undergo masculinization in the uterus, and so the children are born with apparently female external genitalia. If the condition is undiagnosed, they're raised as girls. At puberty, however, the flow of natural testosterone induces masculinization. The voice deepens, the child develops a typically masculine muscular structure, the breasts do not develop as expected, and, the biggest surprise of all, the child's scrotal tissue balloons, the testes descend into it, and what originally appeared to be a clitoris enlarges into a functioning penis. So far, we have just been talking about biological sex, whether an individual is male or female. And we have seen already that things are kind of complicated. In fact, Anne Fausto Sterling has suggested that there are not just two sexes, male and female, but maybe as many as 5 sexes. She adds 3 categories of intersex individuals, 2 groups of pseudo-hermaphrodites, some individuals who are genetically XY but have female anatomy, and others who are genetically XX but have a male anatomy. There are also, very rarely, what might be thought of as true hermaphrodites, who have both male and female genitalia. But of course they're not true hermaphrodites because they can't impregnate themselves. Under genetic control, the undifferentiated gonadal tissue differentiates into either testes or ovaries, but not both. It has to be said that this category of intersex comprises only a relatively small portion of the population, far less than 1%. Still, for these individuals, biological sex is not a simple matter at all. Now all this so far has to do with the newborn baby's biological sex, whether he or she has male or female reproductive anatomy. And here we begin to see the important distinction between biological sex on the one hand and gender identity, gender role, and sexual orientation on the other. For example, take the anomalies of chromosomal XX individuals, the female adrenogenital syndrome and progestin-induced pseudohermaphroditism. In these conditions, despite the surgical correction of the external genitalia, there is no issue about whether the child is a girl. These children are identified as girls at the outset, and when the time comes, they identify themselves as girls. At puberty, children with the female adrenogenital syndrome need to have cortisone therapy because otherwise they won't develop characteristically feminine physical features or menstruate or conceive or bear children. But once the cortisone therapy has been administered, all of that goes on just the way it's supposed to. So these children are identified by other people as girls, they identify themselves as girls, they adopt the standard feminine gender role for their culture, and all the rest. With chromosomal XY individuals, things are sometimes different. In some cases, the Mullerian inhibiting substance fails to differentiate the internal reproductive anatomy, but the condition has no effects on the external genitalia. So genetic males with this condition still have a penis and a scrotum. They're identified as boys and are raised accordingly. In the androgen insensitivity syndrome, however, the fetus is just insensitive to androgen, so there's no masculinization of the internal genitalia, and there's no masculinization of the external genitalia either. There are testes, however, because the differentiation of testes from the undifferentiated gonadal tissue is under genetic control. Anyway, following surgical correction, including removal of the testes, these children are raised as girls. Now, even in males, there is some level of natural estrogen that circulates through the bloodstream. So at the time of puberty, these individuals will get a somewhat feminized physique. These children will identify themselves as girls. However, because these girls do not possess the internal reproductive anatomy of females, they won't get menstrual periods like their girlfriends. In Klinefelter syndrome, 47XXY, these are boys. They may have a somewhat feminized physique, but they're still identified as boys and identify themselves as boys and are raised as boys. They may gradually lose sexual potency and sexual interest, but they typically have a heterosexual erotic orientation, just like most other boys do. What's especially interesting about the Guevadoches is that the children readily shift their gender identities and corresponding gender roles from feminine to masculine at the time of puberty. This is possible because their culture is prepared for the possibility of a spontaneous sex change, because of previous cases that have occurred in the village. The boys are raised as girls from birth until puberty. Then this thing happens, and then the children shift. They're raised as boys from puberty on, and their adolescent and adult behavior, including their sexual behavior, is not appreciably different from the average males. In fact, it's even more interesting now, because with the arrival of modern medicine, this condition is diagnosed at birth, either through chromosomal testing or through palpation of the groin, which reveals undescended testes. Now, these children are identified and raised as boys from birth, appearances to the contrary notwithstanding. All of which is to say that biological sex, certainly chromosomal sex, genetic sex, is not decisive for gender identity or gender role or sexual orientation. Pseudo-hermaphroditic children are of special interest because they're genetic females who experience the effects of male hormones and genetic males who do not experience these effects. Therefore, at least in principle, these children provide an opportunity to observe the effects of prenatal hormones, especially prenatal androgen, on behavior. Observations of this sort might provide evidence of a hypothetical masculinization of the brain, underlying the average differences in behavior between males and females, the the differences between masculine and feminine gender roles. For example, girls with the female adrenogenital syndrome and progestin-induced pseudohermaphroditism generally appear more vigorous and aggressive than control girls. In terms of gender role stereotypes, they're more tomboyish. By comparison, genetic males with the androgen insensitivity syndrome are behaviorally indistinguishable from control girls. Remember, these genetically male children are identified and raised as girls. If they had been identified and raised as boys, they'd probably be labeled as sissies. So, speaking in terms of conventional gender role stereotypes, fetal androgen seems to make girls a little less girlish, and the lack of fetal androgen seems to make boys less boyish. Another condition where we can study this issue is with the children of pregnant women who suffer from severe diabetes and are therefore treated with exogenous estrogen and progesterone in an attempt to prevent miscarriage. These female hormones suppress the action of androgen that would normally circulate to genetically and hormonally male fetuses, but have no effect on the external or internal reproductive anatomy. So these children are identified as boys and are raised as boys. But interestingly, some literature seems to suggest that these boys are somewhat less aggressive and competitive than other boys. On the other hand, the mothers of these children are also sicker than the mothers of control boys, and this by itself may inhibit vigorous play. When we control for maternal illness and pregnancy, the difference tends to disappear. So there may be some hormonal masculinization of the brain, influencing typical sex differences in behavior, but this effect is probably not very powerful. To summarize so far, the program for gender dimorphism begins with the sex chromosomes, XY or XX, which differentiate the gonadal tissues into testes or ovaries, and continues with hormones secreted by the testes which differentiate the internal and external reproductive anatomy. This is the phyletic imprimatur, that process of gender dimorphism that is common to all humans. It is under direct biological control. The phyletic imprimatur endows the fetus with characteristically male or female reproductive anatomy. At birth, the program for gender dimorphism passes from the genes and the hormones to the social environment. But we're not quite done with the phyletic imprimatur. There's more work for it to do. The sex hormones come back at least twice, once in adolescence and again in old age. But at birth, the individual's biographical history takes over, as the parents identify the newborn child as male or female and begin the process of raising him or her according to cultural concepts of masculinity and femininity. Moreover, early in childhood, the child will recognize his or her own gender and identify him or herself as male or female, and begin to model his or her attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors on others of his or her own kind. These social learning processes, which are under environmental control and vary from one culture to another, are collectively known as the social imprimatur. Everyone undergoes gender dimorphism of identity and role, but the outcome will differ from one individual to the next, and from one culture to the next, depending on the details of the social imprimatur. While the phyletic imprimatur has its major effects on the individual's reproductive anatomy, and maybe a little masculinization or feminization of the brain, the effects of the social imprimatur go way beyond reproductive anatomy. They have to do with the individual's gender identity as male or female. And some individuals are transgendered. They have the reproductive equipment of a boy or a man, but identify themselves as a girl or a woman, or vice versa. The social imprimatur is also important for gender role, that is, the individual's adoption of characteristically masculine or feminine aspects of experience, thought, or action. Some aspects of gender role are probably a product of the phyletic imprimatur, in terms of masculinization or feminization of the brain, but other aspects of gender role are clearly a product of socialization and social learning. Finally, we have the individual's erotic orientation, also known as sexual orientation or sexual preference, as heterosexual, males attracted to females and females attracted to males, homosexuals, males attracted to males and females attracted to females, bisexual, or, for that matter, asexual, meaning that the person has little or no sexual interest at all. Everybody adopts a gender identity, expresses a gender role, and feels some erotic attraction. But these do not necessarily go in lockstep with the individual's reproductive anatomy, and they don't necessarily go in lockstep with each other. It's pretty clear what we mean by gender identity and erotic orientation, but what do we mean by gender role? In Western European culture, masculinity is generally characterized by traits of agency and instrumentality. Males are expected to take responsibility for decision-making. They're expected to be independent, active, and to exercise leadership, to be competitive, to take the provider role in the home, and to look for achievement outside the family. By the same token, the traditional Western feminine role emphasizes communality and expressiveness. Women are expected to be sensitive to other people, to express their emotions openly, to be kind, empathetic, and concerned with others, to be concerned with the maintenance of interpersonal harmony, to have an orientation towards caring and nurturance, and to focus on achievement inside the family. Now, obviously, since the feminist revolution that began in the 1960s, these roles have changed a bit. We expect men to have a little bit more communality and expressiveness, and we're not surprised when we find very agentic, highly instrumental women. But still, for all these cultural changes, masculinity and femininity still tend to be defined in this culture in terms of agency and instrumentality versus communality and expressiveness. Now, I realize I just talked about agency and instrumentality versus communality and expressiveness. And indeed, for a long time in psychology, the dominant view was that masculinity and femininity were opposite ends of a single continuum, that to the extent you are a masculine individual, you couldn't have feminine traits, and to the extent that you are highly feminine, you couldn't have masculine characteristics. It's a very intuitive way of thinking about things, not unlike the intuition that positive emotion and negative emotion are polar opposites. But more recently, it's been suggested that masculinity and femininity are in fact independent of each other. So, a person could have high levels of masculinity, but also high levels of femininity. Such individuals are often called androgynous. They're high on both masculinity and femininity, as these are traditionally defined. Other individuals are masculine sex-typed, high on masculinity, low on femininity. Still other individuals are feminine sex-typed, high on femininity, but low on masculinity. And then there are some individuals who seem to be undifferentiated, that is, undifferentiated in terms of the traditional cultural concepts of masculinity and femininity. They seem not to have too many masculine, nor too many particularly feminine traits. Where do individual differences in masculinity and femininity, individual differences in gender role, come from? One hint comes from behavior genetic studies, especially twin studies. Here are the results from a twin study of masculinity and femininity by Robert Dworkin and his colleagues, who followed up a sample of twins originally studied by Irving Gottesman in the mid-1960s. Gottesman administered the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory and the California Psychological Inventory to a large sample of adolescents when they were about 16 years of age. Both of these questionnaires have a scale of masculinity-femininity attached to them. Dworkin and his colleagues also followed up these same individuals and retested them about 12 years later, when they were about 28 years old. You can see that the correlation for monozygotic twins is higher than that for dizygotic twins. But you can also see that the correlation for monozygotic twins is far from a perfect 1.0. Now let's apply the formulas we discussed earlier for estimating the components of population variance. Gender factors account for about 1/3 of individual differences in masculinity and femininity. But the environment is also important, and what's especially important is the non-shared environment, accounting for more than 50% of individual differences in masculinity and femininity. Here's comparable data from a more recent study by John Lowland and his colleagues, who tested a group of elderly twins and also 2 groups of high schoolers. Again, the monozygotic correlations are higher than the dizygotic correlations, but the monozygotic correlations are far from 1.0. Lowland and his colleagues used a somewhat different formula for estimating the components of variance in masculinity and femininity, but their study came to the same conclusion. There is a modest genetic component, but the non-shared environment is of overwhelming importance in determining individual differences in masculinity and femininity. Now, just as a note, both these studies measured masculinity and femininity as opposite poles of a single dimension. To my knowledge, there has not yet been a twin study that measured masculinity and femininity as independent dimensions. This is something that would be very interesting to do. It's these environmental influences that comprise the social imprimatur. At birth, the physical appearance of the child literally structures the environment. The child is identified as a little girl or a little boy and raised accordingly. In the process, the social environment organizes itself so as to produce a more or less masculine boy and a more or less feminine girl. So the appearance of the child literally structures the environment, activating gender role socialization processes by which the environment constrains and supports the child's development of the appropriate gender role. Parents and others, including older siblings, will perceive the child as a boy or a girl and treat him or her in accordance with cultural concepts of masculinity and femininity. In addition, parents and others, including older siblings, will engage in differential modeling of gender role. And differential socialization will continue outside the home, especially in the hands of peers and their parents, teachers, and other authority figures. In the last several decades, television and other media have become increasingly important vehicles for gender role socialization. In these and other ways, the environment constrains and supports the development of the individual's gender role. A study of child-rearing practices by Eleanor Maccabee and her colleagues makes this socialization process clearer. Boys' and girls' rooms are furnished differently. Girls' rooms tend to be more frilly, boys' rooms tend to be more functional. Little boys and little girls are assigned different household chores that mirror those of their older brothers and sisters, or the father or mother. Boys and girls are on the receiving end of differential systems of rewards and punishments, as parents try to shape their behavior so as to conform to their concepts of masculinity and femininity. And the parents will also model different behaviors for their sons and daughters. And this kind of socialization will continue outside the home, in school, in the playground, playdates, and so on. The environmental forces shaping children's gender roles are not by any means subtle. Consider, for example, the different dolls offered for girls and boys to play with. Girls get Barbie and all the things that come with Barbie. Boys get G.I. Joe. Barbie in particular raises concerns because her physical proportions may give girls, and for that matter boys, an idealized body image that is impossible to achieve and may even be undesirable. But the effects of Barbie and G.I. Joe on gender identity and role are not restricted to physical features of the body image. Consider, for example, the controversy that arose in 1967 over the first talking Barbie, who was famous for saying, "Gee, math class is hard." Talking Barbie played directly into gender role stereotypes about sex differences in mathematical ability, and may even have acted to discourage girls from taking advanced courses in mathematics. But gender role socialization is not simply imposed on the child from outside. The child is also an active agent of his or her own gender socialization. Beginning about age 2, children notice, as it were, their own genitalia and identify themselves as boys or girls. This self-identification has a number of consequences. First, the child divides people into two categories according to sex, and identifies him or herself as the same as some others and different from the rest. Children from this age start engaging in gender typing in terms of what's right for boys and what's right for girls, and they start using gender-specific pronouns. They'll also recognize their own photograph as being the photograph of a boy or a girl. The child will attach a positive affective valence to his or her own gender and will begin to actively model him or herself on others who are similarly endowed. Children's recognition of gender seems to be perfected by about age 3, so this happens very quickly. By this time, they strongly prefer objects that are labeled as for their own gender. Similarly, differences in gender role behavior are not reliably observed before age 2, but they are well established by the time the child goes to school. By this time, children will prefer playmates of the same gender. Girls will prefer to play in smaller groups, boys in larger groups. Boys will engage in more roughhousing during play than girls will. And boys playing in groups are more likely to fight than girls. Finally, girls are more likely than boys to turn to adults as resources in both play and study. Actually, children learn both gender roles and adopt the role that is appropriate to their gender identity as male or female. Even so, there is some asymmetry in their preferences. For example, boys actively avoid activities that have been stereotyped as for girls, but girls don't do the same thing for boys' activities. Girls in general tend to show less stringent gender role differentiation, and similarly, fathers enforce stricter gender boundaries than mothers do. With respect to both gender identity and gender role, the child is engaged in an active learning process, acquiring knowledge about who he or she is and how he or she should behave through direct experience of response consequences, observational learning, and also actual teaching. The social learning of gender identity and gender role occurs by precept as well as by example, especially when parents say things like, "Oh, you're a good boy," or "Good boys don't do that." Later on, at the time of puberty, the program for gender dimorphism passes back to the hormones, as indicated by such milestone events as menarche, the onset of menstruation in girls, and nocturnal emissions in boys. The most obvious postnatal effects of the sex hormones are the development of such secondary sex characteristics as the deepening of the voice in males, the development of breasts in females, and the general masculinization or feminization of overall body shape, or physique. These physical changes are instigated by sex hormones, testosterone and estrogen, secreted by the testes and ovaries respectively. There may also be an earlier burst of hormonal activity in girls beginning at about age 6, a milestone called adrenarche, by analogy to menarche. Later in life, there are further dramatic changes in hormone levels. The most obvious of these occur in women, the sudden drop in estrogen levels and cessation of menstruation known as menopause. And there may be a male equivalent, a partial reduction in androgens that is known as andropause, or low T, referring to lowered testosterone levels. Of course, these hormonal effects at puberty and in middle and old age interact with the social imprimatur. The changes in physique that occur with the onset of puberty may support or challenge the child's identity of himself as male or female. And of course, parents and others will impose culturally bound standards for adolescent behavior. In all cultures, parents and others scrutinize adolescents for signs of normality. And the adolescent's gender identities, gender roles, and even erotic orientations become strengthened or challenged. The hormonal changes in middle and old age also interact with the social imprimatur. Menopause may challenge a woman's identification of herself as a woman. And similarly, andropause, partial androgen deficiency, may challenge the gender identity of the aging man. Having discussed the development of gender identity and gender role, it now remains to say something about the development of erotic orientation, whether the person becomes heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, or for that matter, asexual. We can begin at the beginning with two studies by Michael Bailey and his colleagues of the concordance rate for homosexuality in men and women. The MZ concordance rate is substantially higher than the DZ concordance rate, which again provides prima facie evidence for a genetic contribution to homosexuality in both men and women. But it's very clear that when it comes to erotic orientation, as with almost everything else we know about personality and attitudes, the genes are not decisive. The non-shared environment makes a big difference. Nobody has yet come up with a particularly satisfying theory of the origins of homosexuality. But when they do, I suspect we'll discover that the factors that lead someone to become homosexual in erotic orientation are pretty much the same as those that lead people to become heterosexual. Just different. The details will differ, obviously, but the process by which erotic orientation unfolds will be pretty much the same for all of us. Whom we fall in love with is one of the great mysteries unsolved by psychology. It's very clear, however, that when it comes to gender, gender identity, gender role, and erotic orientation are by no means a case of straightforward biological determinism. Even biological sex, one's reproductive anatomy, isn't a straightforward case of biological determinism. But it's very clear that biological sex does not determine gender identity, gender role, or sexual orientation. What also becomes clear is that matters of gender are very, very complicated. It's not by any means a simple matter of masculine males mating with feminine females. There are dozens, hundreds of ways for these gender-related attributes to combine and interact. But through it all, we see the interaction of nature and nurture, the person, the environment, the role that the person has in creating his or her own environment, and the active engagement of the person beginning almost at birth and continuing throughout the life cycle as an agent in the development of his or her own identity and personality.